A little girl standing alone in a room full of millionaires should never be invisible, yet sometimes the quietest soul carries the loudest truth. The crystal ballroom shimmered beneath towering chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors, where laughter floated as easily as the music drifting from a string quartet tucked beside a sweeping staircase. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd with silver trays balanced in practiced hands, while the city's wealthiest business leaders exchanged handshakes, stories, and polished smiles beneath banners celebrating another record-breaking charity gala. Every tailored tuxedo, sparkling evening gown, and carefully rehearsed conversation blended into a picture of effortless success, but Ethan Brooks noticed something no one else seemed willing to see. Standing alone beside a floor-to-ceiling window was a little girl who could not have been older than 8. She wore a simple pale blue dress that looked clean but modest beside the designer clothing surrounding her. Her blonde hair rested neatly on her shoulders, and her small hands were folded together as she quietly watched the guests instead of trying to join them. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frightened. She simply looked like someone waiting for a promise that everyone else had forgotten. Ethan paused in the middle of a conversation with a senator who was explaining the newest investment initiative. He heard every word, yet somehow none of them reached him anymore. His attention remained fixed on the child by the window. "Excuse me," he said politely, offering an apologetic smile before stepping away. The senator nodded, assuming another billionaire had spotted another important donor across the room. Ethan walked slowly, careful not to startle the girl. The polished leather soles of his shoes barely made a sound against the marble as soft piano notes drifted through the ballroom. Outside the enormous windows, the Chicago skyline sparkled beneath a clear spring sky, thousands of lights stretching toward the horizon like stars that had settled upon the earth. As Ethan came closer, he realized something else that made his heart tighten. Every few seconds, the little girl glanced toward the grand entrance, then quietly lowered her eyes again. She wasn't admiring the decorations. She was waiting for someone who hadn't arrived. "Hi there," Ethan said gently, stopping several feet away so she would feel comfortable. "That's a pretty view, isn't it?" The girl looked up with calm blue eyes that seemed far older than any child should possess. She gave a tiny nod. "Yes, sir." "Are you here with your family?" Ethan asked kindly. She looked toward the ballroom once more before answering. "I thought I was." Ethan felt an unexpected weight settle inside his chest. Around them, applause suddenly erupted as another generous donation was announced from the stage, yet the celebration sounded strangely distant. He noticed no parent searching the room, no anxious voice calling a child's name, no security staff speaking into radios. Hundreds of successful adults filled the ballroom, but no one appeared to realize a little girl stood completely alone. Ethan offered a reassuring smile. "Would you like me to help you find whoever brought you here?" For the first time, the girl studied his face carefully, almost as though she had spent a long time imagining this exact moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her small cardigan and slowly pulled out an old silver pocket watch, its surface worn with age but polished with extraordinary care. She held it toward him with trembling fingers and whispered, "My mommy said that if I ever found Mr. Ethan Brooks, I should give this back to him because he would finally remember us." Ethan Brooks stared at the silver pocket watch resting in the little girl's open palm, and for a brief moment the sounds of the ballroom seemed to disappear into a distant echo. The engraved case reflected the chandelier light, revealing tiny scratches that could only come from years of careful use. His breathing slowed. He knew that watch. He had not seen it in almost a decade. His fingers hesitated before gently accepting it, as though touching the object too quickly might cause the fragile moment to vanish. He pressed the release, and the cover clicked open with the same familiar sound he remembered from long ago. Inside was an old photograph, faded around the edges but still clear enough to recognize. A younger Ethan stood beside a smiling woman on a quiet lakeside dock during a charity volunteer trip many years before his business empire had reached international headlines. Her bright eyes reflected the afternoon sun, and the smile she wore had once made difficult days feel surprisingly hopeful. Ethan closed the watch slowly. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this?" The little girl looked at him with complete sincerity. "My mommy gave it to me before she got sick. She said if I ever felt completely alone, I should find you." Ethan swallowed hard, not because he feared the answer, but because he already suspected it. "What was your mother's name?" The girl lowered her eyes for a second before answering softly. "Grace Sullivan." The name settled over him like a forgotten melody carried back by the wind. Grace. A woman who had spent months organizing food drives, rebuilding community centers, and quietly helping families without ever asking for recognition. She had believed kindness was never wasted, even when no one noticed. They had worked side by side during one unforgettable summer before life pulled them toward different futures. Ethan had searched for her after accepting a business opportunity overseas, but every lead had disappeared, and eventually the demands of success buried the search beneath endless meetings, investments, and responsibilities. Yet he had never forgotten the watch. He had given it to Grace on the evening she celebrated opening her first neighborhood learning center, telling her that every meaningful promise deserved something that could outlast time. The little girl watched him carefully. "She said you would remember when you saw it." Ethan nodded slowly. She was right. Around them, crystal glasses clinked together as another speech began near the stage, but neither of them looked toward the applause. The warmth of the ballroom suddenly felt strangely empty compared to the quiet honesty standing before him. "Are you here by yourself?" Ethan asked gently. Lily nodded. A nice lady at the front desk thought. I belonged with one of the guests. Nobody asked many questions because everyone looked busy. Ethan glanced around the room again. Hundreds of influential people continued smiling for photographs while a child had quietly wandered through their celebration unnoticed. He felt an ache that no financial success could ever erase. "Have you eaten tonight?" he asked. Lily smiled politely. "I had one cookie. It was very good." Ethan almost smiled, but sadness softened the corners of his eyes instead. "You deserve much more than one cookie." He motioned toward a nearby table where warm rolls, fresh fruit, and small desserts had been arranged for guests. Lily waited until he nodded before taking a small apple instead of reaching for the expensive pastries surrounding it. Ethan noticed the choice immediately. She was careful. Thoughtful. Unaccustomed to asking for more than she absolutely needed. As she quietly thanked him, Ethan looked at the silver watch once more. Something deep inside him, something buried beneath years of boardrooms, headlines, and endless ambition, had begun to awaken. He realized that finding Grace's daughter tonight could not have been an accident, and somewhere beyond the music, beyond the speeches, and beyond the glittering ballroom, a forgotten promise was beginning to call him home. While Lily quietly finished the apple, Ethan slipped his phone from his pocket and sent a single message to his chief of security. He did not ask for alarms or dramatic interruptions. He simply requested every entry record from the evening, the guest list, and the registration log for every employee, volunteer, and vendor who had entered the ballroom since noon. Within seconds the reply arrived. His team was already working. Ethan returned his full attention to Lily, choosing calm over urgency because children always noticed the emotions adults tried to hide. "Would you mind sitting with me for a few minutes?" he asked gently. Lily nodded without hesitation. They found a quiet table overlooking the city lights where the music became softer and the conversations blended into a gentle hum. For the first time that evening Ethan noticed how tired she looked. There were faint circles beneath her eyes, yet she continued to smile with remarkable patience. "Did your mother tell you I would be here tonight?" Ethan asked. Lily shook her head. "No, sir. She only said that if I ever saw your name somewhere, I should try to meet you because you always kept your promises." Ethan lowered his eyes. Those words hurt more than any criticism he had ever received. Success had filled his calendar, but somewhere along the journey he had failed to keep the one promise that mattered most. His phone vibrated quietly again. The report was surprisingly brief. No registration under Lily Sullivan. No registration under Grace Sullivan. No guest had signed in with either name. No security camera showed the little girl entering through the main ballroom entrance. Ethan frowned. It was as though she had appeared without anyone noticing. He excused himself for only a moment and walked toward the event coordinator. "Has anyone reported a missing child?" he asked. The woman looked confused. "No, Mr. Brooks. We have not received a single report." Ethan thanked her politely and continued toward the concierge desk near the lobby. The manager recognized him immediately and greeted him with a respectful smile. "Did anyone escort a little blonde girl into the gala?" Ethan asked. The manager thought carefully before answering. "One of our reception volunteers mentioned a very polite child who said she was waiting for someone important. She never caused any trouble, so everyone assumed she belonged to one of the invited families." Ethan nodded slowly. Kindness without attention could easily become neglect. Returning to the table, he found Lily quietly watching the city through the enormous windows. Snowflakes had begun drifting across the Chicago skyline, catching the glow of the streetlights like tiny pieces of silver. She seemed completely peaceful despite carrying a burden no child should have carried alone. "May I ask you something?" Ethan said. "Of course. Where have you been living?" Lily answered honestly. "At St. Anne's family house with Miss Eleanor. She lets me help water the flowers every morning." Ethan recognized the name immediately. It was a small community shelter his foundation had anonymously supported for years. He had read quarterly reports, approved funding, and signed paperwork without ever visiting the people whose lives depended on it. A quiet feeling of regret settled inside him once again. "Did Miss Eleanor bring you here?" Lily smiled softly. "No. She does not know I came. I borrowed the city bus because I saw your picture on a poster outside the library yesterday." Ethan looked at the little girl with growing amazement. She had crossed part of the city carrying nothing except an old pocket watch and the hope that one promise still mattered. Before he could speak again, Lily reached carefully into her cardigan and removed a neatly folded envelope with Ethan's name written across the front in graceful handwriting he recognized instantly. His heart skipped a beat because he had not seen Grace Sullivan's handwriting in almost 10 years, and somehow he already knew that whatever waited inside the envelope was about to change everything he believed he had lost. For several long seconds Ethan simply looked at the envelope without opening it. The elegant handwriting across the front carried him back to another season of his life, when success had been measured by the number of families they helped instead of quarterly reports and international headlines. Grace had always written his name exactly the same way, careful, graceful, and filled with quiet confidence. Lily watched him patiently. She did not rush him. She seemed to understand that some memories needed a moment before they could become words again. Ethan finally slid one finger beneath the seal and unfolded the neatly preserved letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with time, but every line remained perfectly readable. "Dear Ethan," it began, "if you are reading this, then life has finally brought our paths together again through someone much more important than either of us. Please do not blame yourself for the years that have passed. You searched longer than you know, but sometimes life moves people onto roads they never planned to travel. I wanted to contact you many times, yet each time I believed I needed to solve my own struggles first. That day never came. Instead, I learned something you once taught me. Real strength is accepting kindness before it is too late." Ethan paused, closing his eyes for a brief moment as emotion quietly settled over him. He continued reading. "The little girl beside you has spent her entire life believing there are still good people who keep their promises. Please do not let that belief disappear. She has a heart that notices lonely people before anyone else does. She laughs at small things. She loves libraries, apple pie, and watching snow fall against old windows. If she ever finds you, it means she trusted hope more than fear, just as I always tried to do. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. His voice was almost silent. When did your mother give you this? Lily folded her hands together. Last spring. She told me to keep it safe until I found you. Ethan nodded, understanding that Grace had planned carefully for a future she knew she might never see herself. The realization filled him with both gratitude and sorrow. Before he could ask another question, his phone vibrated once more. This time the message came directly from his executive assistant. She had already contacted St. Anne's family house. Miss Eleanor had confirmed that Lily lived there and that Grace Sullivan had volunteered at the shelter for several years before becoming seriously ill. She had never spoken badly about anyone. She had simply told everyone that one day an old friend would remember an unfinished promise. Ethan looked toward the ballroom where another standing ovation echoed through the crystal hall. Wealthy donors applauded generous gifts measured in millions of dollars, yet none of them realized that the greatest act of generosity that evening had arrived carrying nothing except an old pocket watch and a folded letter. He looked back at Lily. Would you like to tell me about your mother? A warm smile appeared across her face, brighter than any chandelier above them. She always smiled when she talked about you, Lily said. She said you listened to people even when nobody else did. She said you never walked past someone who felt invisible. Ethan felt those words settle deeply inside him because lately he was no longer certain they described the man he had become. Years of responsibility had slowly replaced quiet moments with endless schedules. Somewhere along the journey he had stopped seeing individuals and started seeing numbers, projects, and meetings. Lily reached into the envelope once more and gently unfolded a second piece of paper that Ethan had not noticed before. It was much smaller than the letter, almost like a page torn from a notebook. On it was a simple hand-drawn map leading to a place outside the city, and beneath the map Grace had written just 7 words that made Ethan's heart race with quiet disbelief. Everything you have been searching for is here. The small hand-drawn map remained between Ethan and Lily as though it carried the weight of years that neither of them could recover. He studied every line carefully. The road curved west beyond the city limits, crossed a narrow river, and ended beside a tiny chapel marked with a single oak tree. Ethan knew the place immediately. It was not famous, impressive, or expensive. Years ago, he and Grace had spent an afternoon there after finishing a volunteer project, sitting beneath the old branches while talking about the kind of future they hoped would never be measured by money alone. He had not returned since that day. Did your mother ever take you there? He asked softly. Lily smiled. Every spring. She said it was where people remembered what mattered most. Ethan folded the map with great care and placed it beside the silver pocket watch. His phone buzzed again, but this time he silenced it without reading the message. Board members, investors, and public officials could wait. The little girl sitting across from him had already waited long enough. Around them the charity gala continued with polished speeches and generous applause, yet Ethan noticed details that had escaped him earlier in the evening. A waiter quietly refilled empty glasses without anyone thanking him. A young violinist continued playing beautiful music while most guests spoke loudly over every note. A volunteer carefully arranged donated books near the entrance where almost no one stopped to look. Grace had always noticed people like that. She believed the world changed because ordinary acts of kindness were seen instead of ignored. Ethan suddenly realized how much of her perspective had quietly returned through Lily. Would you like to leave the ballroom for a little while? He asked. Lily nodded. It is loud in here. They stepped onto a peaceful terrace overlooking the river that wound through the city. Cool evening air carried the fresh scent of spring rain mixed with flowering trees planted along the waterfront. The distant traffic blended with the gentle sound of water moving below, creating the kind of quiet Grace had always loved. Ethan rested his hands on the stone railing. I searched for your mother, he admitted. For a very long time. Then every trail disappeared. I thought she wanted to be left alone. Lily looked at him with gentle understanding beyond her years. She never stopped believing you would come back. She just did not want you to feel guilty if life became different. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Grace had protected his heart even while carrying burdens of her own. That was exactly the woman he remembered. Lily reached into her cardigan once more and removed a small pressed white flower sealed inside clear paper. She asked me to keep this too, she said. She picked it beside the chapel last year. Ethan accepted it carefully, afraid even his fingertips might damage something so delicate. It reminded him that hope often survived in the smallest things. At that moment his assistant quietly stepped onto the terrace but remained several feet away out of respect. Mr. Brooks, she said gently, I found something you should know. Grace Sullivan left a safety deposit box at a neighborhood bank. According to the records, it can only be opened by you and Lily together. Ethan looked from the flower to the little girl standing beside him. Nothing about this evening had happened by chance. Grace had arranged each step with remarkable wisdom, trusting that kindness and patience would eventually lead them to the same place. Ethan offered Lily a warm smile, one that reached his eyes for the first time in years. Tomorrow morning, he said quietly, we are going to follow your mother's map, open that box together, and finally finish the promise that should have been kept a long time ago. The following morning arrived wrapped in soft gray clouds as Ethan's black sedan traveled west beyond the busy streets of Chicago, leaving behind towering glass buildings for quiet country roads lined with budding maple trees and weathered wooden fences. Lily sat beside him in the back seat, her small hands gently holding the silver pocket watch while the folded map rested safely on her lap. Neither of them spoke very much. Some journeys deserved silence because words could never carry everything the heart was trying to understand. As the city slowly disappeared behind them, Ethan noticed how different the world looked when he was not rushing toward another meeting. Farmers waved from tractors crossing distant fields. Children waited patiently beside yellow school buses. A family-owned bakery had already placed fresh pies in its front window. Grace had always loved noticing simple moments like these. She believed they reminded people that success was measured by the lives they touched instead of the numbers they accumulated. After nearly an hour they reached the little chapel marked on the map. Time had aged the white wooden building, but not its quiet beauty. The old oak tree still stretched its broad branches across the small yard exactly as Ethan remembered. Tiny white flowers covered the grass beneath it, dancing gently whenever the spring breeze passed through. Lily smiled the moment she stepped from the car. Mommy always said this place sounded peaceful because people whispered their prayers instead of shouting them. Ethan looked around slowly. Every memory returned with remarkable clarity. He remembered helping Grace repair one of the broken benches after a community picnic. He remembered promising that no matter where life led them, they would always find time to come back and help others here. Standing beneath the familiar oak tree, he realized how completely that promise had disappeared beneath years of business growth and endless obligations. They walked quietly toward a small stone bench where someone had recently placed fresh wildflowers inside a simple glass jar. There was no expensive decoration, no polished marble, only quiet dignity. Lily knelt beside the flowers and smiled softly. These were not here last spring, she whispered. Ethan noticed a handwritten card tucked beneath the jar. It simply read, "Thank you, Grace, for reminding us that kindness always grows back." His throat tightened. Even after her passing, Grace continued changing lives through the seeds of compassion she had planted years before. A gentle voice interrupted the silence. "You finally came." Ethan turned to see an elderly groundskeeper walking slowly toward them with a warm smile. His name tag read Samuel. The older man looked first at Lily, then at Ethan, as though recognizing both of them without needing introductions. "Grace asked me to give you something if you ever arrived together." From the pocket of his worn work jacket he carefully removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She visited every spring, Samuel explained. She always believed this day would come. She said 2 people would arrive carrying hope instead of answers. Ethan accepted the key with quiet gratitude. She trusted far more than I deserved, he admitted. Samuel shook his head gently. No, son. She trusted the goodness she saw inside you long before the rest of the world did. Those words settled deeply within Ethan. For years he had been praised for building companies, creating jobs, and donating millions of dollars, yet the compliment that touched him most came from an elderly groundskeeper standing beneath an old oak tree. Lily looked toward the narrow road leading away from the chapel. The bank is only a few more miles, she said softly. Ethan smiled. Then let us finish what your mother started. As they returned to the car, the morning sunlight finally broke through the clouds, filling the little chapel with warm golden light, and for the first time in many years Ethan felt that he was no longer chasing success. He was finally walking toward home. The neighborhood bank stood on a quiet corner beneath rows of mature elm trees, its red brick walls and polished brass door seeming untouched by the hurried rhythm of the modern world. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no reporters following Ethan Brooks, and no curious crowd gathering around one of the wealthiest men in America. For the first time in years, he was grateful to walk through a front door where no one recognized his name before recognizing his smile. Lily stayed close beside him, still holding the silver pocket watch while Ethan carefully carried the small brass key Samuel had entrusted to them. An elderly bank manager greeted them warmly after listening to Ethan explain why they had come. The woman checked several records before looking up with gentle surprise. Grace Sullivan was very specific, she said softly. She instructed us that this box could only be opened when both of you stood here together. Ethan and Lily exchanged a quiet glance before following her down a narrow hallway lined with rows of safety deposit boxes that had protected families' memories for generations. The manager stopped before one small box, inserted her master key, and stepped back. The rest belongs to you. Ethan took a slow breath and carefully placed Grace's brass key into the second lock. The mechanism turned with a soft click that echoed through the silent room. Together, he and Lily gently pulled the box forward and placed it upon a polished oak table beneath a warm reading lamp. Inside rested only 3 simple items. There was a worn leather journal tied with a blue ribbon, a sealed envelope addressed to Lily, and a neatly folded legal document. Nothing about the contents reflected wealth, yet Ethan immediately understood they were more valuable than anything money could purchase. Lily carefully opened the envelope with her name written across the front. She smiled as she quietly read the first few lines, then looked toward Ethan. Mommy says I should read this part out loud. Ethan nodded. Lily's small voice filled the peaceful room. If you are hearing these words, then I already know you found Mr. Brooks. Sweetheart, remember what I always told you. People are not measured by what they own. They are measured by the kindness they leave behind. Do not ask Ethan to replace me because nobody ever could. Instead, allow him the chance to become the friend I always believed he would be. Ethan lowered his head, overcome by the grace contained in every sentence. There was no blame. No regret. Only forgiveness and hope. He untied the ribbon around the leather journal and slowly opened the first page. Grace had filled it with handwritten stories collected over the years. There were names of families she had helped, children who had learned to read, elderly neighbors who had received groceries, volunteers who had inspired one another through simple acts of compassion. Every page reminded Ethan of the life they once dreamed of building together, one quiet act of kindness at a time. Halfway through the journal he discovered a pressed white flower identical to the one Lily had carried from the chapel. Beside it Grace had written, "Success grows upward. Kindness grows outward. Never confuse the two." Ethan closed the journal slowly, feeling those words settle deep within his heart. Finally, he unfolded the legal document. It was not a will, nor did it contain hidden wealth. Instead, It transferred the stewardship of Grace's small community learning center to Ethan's charitable foundation under one condition. The center could never bear her name or his. It would simply be called the Second Chance House because Grace believed dignity belonged to everyone equally. Ethan looked at Lily, whose eyes shone with quiet hope rather than expectation. He smiled gently. "Your mother never wanted to leave behind a fortune," he whispered. "She wanted to leave behind a future." Lily reached for his hand without saying a word, and as their fingers met across the old wooden table, Ethan realized the greatest inheritance Grace had protected inside that small deposit box had never been the journal, the letters, or the documents. It was the chance for two lonely lives to become one family through kindness instead of obligation. When Ethan and Lily stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, the world somehow felt quieter than it had only a few hours before. The brass key rested inside Ethan's jacket pocket, the leather journal was tucked carefully beneath his arm, and Grace's final gift lingered inside his heart far more deeply than any document ever could. They drove back toward the city with the windows slightly open, allowing the cool spring breeze to carry the scent of fresh grass and flowering trees into the car. For several miles neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt comfortable, like two people slowly discovering they no longer needed to hide behind careful words. As the skyline appeared again in the distance, Lily looked out the window and quietly asked, "Do you think Mommy would be happy today?" Ethan smiled gently before answering. "I think she would tell us that today is only the beginning." Lily nodded thoughtfully. She always said beginnings are usually disguised as endings. Ethan glanced at her with quiet admiration. Grace had not only left behind a remarkable little girl. She had passed on a way of seeing the world that money could never purchase. Instead of driving directly to his downtown office tower, Ethan asked the driver to make one unexpected stop. Minutes later the car pulled into the parking lot of St. Anne's family house. The modest brick building stood beneath tall maple trees, its playground filled with colorful drawings made by children who had learned to create joy from very little. Miss Eleanor hurried outside the moment she recognized Lily. Relief filled her eyes before she wrapped the little girl in a warm embrace. "I have been worried all morning," she admitted softly. Lily hugged her tightly. "I am sorry. I had to find someone Mommy told me about." Miss Eleanor looked toward Ethan with cautious curiosity. He introduced himself simply, without mentioning business titles or accomplishments. "Thank you for caring for Lily," he said sincerely. "I do not think words are enough." Miss Eleanor smiled kindly. "Grace thanked us every day, but the truth is that Lily brought just as much hope to this house as we ever gave her." Ethan asked if they could walk through the shelter together. Miss Eleanor gladly agreed. They visited classrooms where volunteers helped children with homework after school. They stopped inside a cozy library filled with donated books whose shelves Grace herself had organized years earlier. In the dining room, Ethan noticed framed photographs of families who had rebuilt their lives one step at a time. Grace appeared in several of them, always standing near the back, smiling quietly while someone else received the attention. Ethan understood immediately. She had never wanted recognition. She had wanted results. As they finished the tour, Miss Eleanor opened a small office drawer and removed a notebook filled with handwritten ideas. Grace was planning a community learning center expansion before she became too ill, she explained. She worried the children would never see it finished. Ethan slowly opened the notebook. Every page overflowed with thoughtful plans for reading programs, music classes, family counseling, and gardens where children could learn to grow flowers and vegetables together. There were no extravagant dreams, only practical acts of compassion designed to restore dignity one family at a time. Ethan closed the notebook with quiet determination. "This project will be completed," he said calmly. "Not because I can afford it, but because Grace already showed us why it matters." Lily looked up at him with hopeful eyes. "Can I help?" Ethan smiled warmly. "You already are." As evening sunlight poured through the shelter windows, painting golden patterns across the wooden floor, Ethan realized that every major decision he had made during the past decade had been driven by growth, expansion, and achievement. Yet the decision that brought him the deepest peace required none of those things. It required only the courage to open his heart again. Looking at Lily standing beside Miss Eleanor, Ethan quietly understood that family is not always created by the people who share your past. Sometimes it begins with the people who choose to share your future. 3 months later, the grand reopening of the Second Chance House drew together neighbors, teachers, volunteers, business leaders, and families from every corner of the community, yet there was nothing extravagant about the celebration. Fresh flowers lined the entrance. Children had painted colorful welcome signs that fluttered gently in the spring breeze. The scent of homemade apple pie drifted from the community kitchen while laughter echoed across the newly restored courtyard where raised garden beds waited for tiny hands to plant the season's first vegetables. Ethan Brooks stood quietly near the back of the gathering instead of on the stage prepared for honored guests. He had politely declined every request to deliver the opening speech. This day had never been about him. It had never been about wealth, recognition, or headlines. It belonged to the people whose lives would grow stronger because one woman had believed kindness was the greatest investment anyone could make. Lily stood beside him wearing the same gentle smile that had first caught his attention on the night they met. She was no longer carrying only memories. She was carrying hope. Her school backpack rested over one shoulder, and tucked carefully inside was Grace's leather journal, now filled with new pages where Lily had begun recording small acts of kindness she witnessed each week. Ethan smiled when he noticed the familiar blue ribbon still tied around it. Some traditions deserved to continue. Miss Eleanor welcomed everyone before inviting several children to share what the Learning Center meant to them. One little boy proudly explained that he had finished his first chapter book. Another girl smiled as she described learning to play the piano after believing she never could. Parents wiped away quiet tears while volunteers applauded every story. There were no dramatic announcements. No oversized donation checks. Only ordinary people celebrating extraordinary grace. Finally, Miss Eleanor stepped to the microphone once more. Many people have asked why this building is called the Second Chance House instead of carrying the name of its founder or its benefactor, she said warmly. The answer is simple. Real kindness does not ask to be remembered. It asks to be repeated. A peaceful silence settled across the courtyard. Ethan lowered his eyes, recognizing Grace's heart in every word. Miss Eleanor smiled toward Lily. Would you like to plant the first flower? Lily nodded happily and walked to the center garden where a small oak sapling waited beside fresh soil. Ethan joined her without being asked. Together they knelt beneath the warm afternoon sun. Lily carefully placed the young tree into the ground while Ethan gently covered its roots with soil. Neither of them hurried. They understood that strong things grew slowly. After patting the earth into place, Lily looked up at Ethan with quiet curiosity. Do you think it will become as big as the one by the chapel? Ethan smiled. If people care for it the way your mother cared for others, it will grow even stronger. Lily slipped her small hand into his. This time she did not ask for permission. She simply held on as though she already knew she belonged. Ethan looked across the courtyard where children laughed, volunteers served food, and neighbors greeted one another like old friends. He realized that Grace had been right all along. Success could build impressive buildings, but only love could turn them into homes. Reporters who had quietly gathered near the entrance lowered their cameras. Business leaders stopped their conversations. Parents fell silent. No one wanted to interrupt the simple moment unfolding before them. A billionaire stood beside a little girl beneath a newly planted oak tree, and without speeches, applause, or grand declarations, everyone understood what had truly happened. A lonely child had found a family. A weary father had found his way back to the man he was always meant to be. And somewhere beyond the gentle rustling of new leaves, It almost felt as though Grace's quiet faith had become the miracle she believed kindness would one day bring.